consequences, and the best for the most. During last week's survey of the meta-ethical positions, we considered quite a few candidates for who or what people may consider to be fit to judge them or to judge the morality or immorality of their actions. We considered the moral subjectivist position, where if a moral subjectivist is asked who or what ultimately has the authority, has the right to judge you in terms of the morality or immorality of your action. Well, the moral subjectivist is going to answer that. It can be simplified to just, well, me. Only me. I am the only one who can judge whether I did something right or wrong in a given scenario. That would be the moral subjectivist. The moral relativist is his or her answer will be, a we. Who or what is authorized to judge the morality or immorality of a moral relativist's actions? Typically the group, the culture. It could be a professional organization. It could be quite a few. I mean, any imaginable group that has a cohesion and that people are willing to accept certain rules of the game of the group. To be a member of the group, you have to do certain things. And if you do other things, then you may have acted more or less good or bad, morally or immorally. And so that's kind of a we. The moral relativist is who has the authority to judge me? Well, the we, the groups that I am a part of. Well, then we can go the next step and say, well, what about the moral objectivist? Well, the moral objectivist would say, when asked that question, who or what can judge me as far as morality goes? Well, they're going to use a version of what I gave a sort of little handy, grab on word. It's like a we plus. It will be something that is beyond individual groups. It'll be typically it's notions like humanity or nature, like think crimes against humanity, those kind of trials. Well, the moral objectivist, they would say, yes, we can hold certain humans accountable based on their action affronted humanity. It would have been bad. It made us all less than we would have been due to that action taking place. But as we'll see today and next week, there are other versions of moral objectivism that how they define the little plus after the we, like we plus, the way they define that we, that plus makes all the difference in the world and it can be, as we'll see today and next week, it can be a bundle of values or a sort of core principle can be that plus for the moral objectivist, that supragroup sort of standard or principle or set of values that is used to judge or praise. One can be morally blamed or shamed, or one could be morally praised for having done the right thing or a good thing via using, some standards. We'll see it today. And then finally there is, or not finally, but next to the last, there's the moral absolutist, which is going to use, is the judge will be some form of an it normally. It doesn't have to be, but typically that's what it will be. It's going to be something of a divine nature or something well beyond humanity. That it's going to be something beyond humanity. Typically, it's likely to be beyond science and empirical investigation. And an absolutist, something will be right and wrong. Why? Because that divine being says so, and that's the end of it. There's no negotiation with an absolutist. They are absolute in their commitments of what exactly can judge them. And then the final thing is, or the final moral metaethical position is the moral mishmash, which is what many people tend to be, which is just a conglomerate of all of the others. That depending on the exact issue or the question or the moral dilemma, ethical moral dilemma at a given time, depending on which values are at stake or coming into conflict in a disagreement, a moral ethical disagreement, one might be a little bit of a moral subjectivist, then they'll have a sprinkling of moral relativism. And then when it comes to a different sort of ethical value conflict, one may be more of a moral objectivist or an absolutist. We saw examples of that last week. So that's kind of the moral mishmash. The moral mishmash is extremely difficult to navigate when it comes to the argumentation, the reasoning, the values that may be in play. That's what many people tend to be, or the way many of us live in the world. We show characteristics and traits of all of the positions. But if a person could just be one of them, it would make things so much more straightforward when it comes to moral assessment and deciding, is something right or wrong. It would be easier. But unfortunately, the world we live in, things are not always easy when it comes to ethics and morality and ethical moral value conflicts. It tends not to be quite so easy. But as we'll see today, there may yet be hope for a simple set of answers. We will see. Everyone will have the opportunity to think about a particular answer to a set of questions today and see what they think, especially during this week's discussion. But given that we've seen these meta-ethical positions, recall also that they're what's assumed by a lot of the authors of the various textbook readings or the videos we'll see later this semester, many of the articles. All people typically assume one or more of those meta-ethical positions. They take that as a given before they ever start talking about, for example, abortion or euthanasia or the ethics of war, or is it okay to sometimes shoot non-combatants in a military conflict situation because they're being used as human shields and the bad folks are behind them and we can't let the bad folks escape, or so that's the sort of way it's looked at times. And so people will assume something has the ultimate authority when it comes to judging them or not. It could be, a more relativistic assumption, if one was a soldier, would be, well, the main group that can judge me is the military. They have the authority over me. If they say, yeah, we have to take out these combatants and they happen to be using others as human shields, then the human shields may not make it. And I will have acted okay morally because the military's granted me this sort of ability at this time. I've gotten, in a sense, a moral pass. It's typically not good to shoot non-combatants, but in this context, my group that I'm a member of, maybe a branch of the military, has ordered me to do, to solve this problem, and this is the most effective way to do it. Or it's an unavoidable way. It cannot be avoided. I mean, we've all seen and heard of scenarios like this. Movies love to consider this scenario. But that being said, knowing who or what it's kind of like having a handle on who or what you think has the authority to morally judge your actions. That's helpful. That's great. But the very next question always is, okay, so say that I buy in that groups that I'm a member of, they ultimately judge the morality or immorality of my action. Well, the very next question is, well, what do the groups want me to do? What do they want me to do, or what do they expect me to do and expect me not to do? Like, when is the specific action, according to my group, moral or immoral? When will it be labeled like when if I do something, when will that thing be morally good, morally bad, or morally neutral, morally indifferent? When and exactly which actions fall into which of those categories? Essentially, what does the group or the moral judge want me to do? And then do I have any way of figuring that out? It's like it's great to know who judges you, but the very next thing is, well, what do they actually want so I don't get judged badly? I don't want to incur the wrath of my moral judge or moral authority. We'd rather receive its praise. Now, I think most people tend to go that route where where many people do kind of want to know when is something right to do, when is it wrong to do, when is it good or bad to do, and and especially in reference to who or what they think has the authority to judge them. So that's our questions that we need answers to. Is the first one is when is a specific action or rule moral or immoral? And then the second one immediately behind it is, are there reliable ways to accurately make these types of determinations? Well, what does our morality judge want us to do? And do we have ways to find that out? Those seem like important questions, significant questions. For those who kind of are a little doubtful about that, like, well, maybe we don't really need to know the answers to these questions, or it's not really helpful to spend time trying to answer them. Well, here are some examples, some scenarios, and I'll go through these briefly. We will have the ability to really think about this last one, the driverless cars, a lot more. But the first scenario that one could be confronted with is they're aware of who or what they think can judge them. But then they run into this scenario where, say, you have two friends. They're good friends. You are very good friends with two people. And you find out that one of the friends happens to be cheating on your other friend. And you're friends with them both. And you find out that one of them is being unfaithful. And you know that the other person doesn't know. And then the question occurs. People sometimes have to deal with this in everyday life. It's like, well, what do I do? Would it be morally or ethically okay for me to tell the person that's being cheated on? Is the value of informing that person about the infidelity of the other person, does that value cancel out the potential disvalue of losing one or more of them as friends? I mean, assume these are your good friends, but sometimes people behave extremely badly if they feel like they've been betrayed. And it's totally possible, whether one is guilty of infidelity or not, that the person could very well feel like you have betrayed their trust. Like, friendship comes with trust and responsibilities. I mean, we never have friends when we don't trust people in some sort of way, or likewise they reciprocate that trust, and so trust could be violated. And so a person ends up with this value conflict, that they know that there's a lot of value in the friendship. They do value the trustworthiness aspect of the friendship. They also value the very fact that these are their friends. And yet, there's a huge disvalue to, say, their point of view, or the group that they're a member of, or their divine it out there, or whatever that they consider to say, yeah, that's bad. Infidelity is a bad thing, and that's a really bad thing, and it's not right for someone to go around unaware of that. And so they may feel a moral obligation or an ethical obligation to inform one of their friends about the infidelity of the other one. And that can be a big struggle in an individual's mind and throughout their daily life. The person can worry about this for days and weeks. And so wouldn't it be awesome to say, well, what would morality or ethics actually have me do? Is there a way for me to figure that out? When is this specific action that I'm contemplating to tell or not to tell, to spill the beans or keep my mouth shut? Which of those two it would be the more moral course? Which would be the more ethical or moral course of action? Wouldn't it be awesome to be able to have an answer to that question rather than struggle with it for days? And so, well, let's say that example doesn't really appeal to one. Well, here's one that when I first started out with jobs, I worked as a mechanic, an automotive mechanic. And this is an event from my past where a car had come into the shop, and they had come in to have their brakes, their front and rear brakes redone on the car. And those who may be familiar, the brakes, typically they'll have like what's known as brake pads that push it, that when you depress the brake, it pushes up against, it squeezes a rotor in the front wheels, and it may push against a sort of steel drum in the back, and that's how cars are slowed down by brakes. That's the simple story. There's hydraulics involved, a whole lot of other things. But at the end of the day, it was to take the old brake pads off that were worn out and put some new ones on the car. That was my task. Well, as soon as I'd taken the old brakes off, I looked, and the parts person for the shop that I worked for had handed me some brakes. Now I looked and I picked them up, and I was like, these are cheap, very sucky brakes. I mean, it looked like the glue was kind of, nasty on them. It looked like these would not last. They were extremely low quality brake pads. And so I had this moment of thought where I was like, okay, I really don't want to put these on the car. Well, why? Well, because there's a huge safety factor here. It's a huge safety risk that a person can be driving this car and say that the brake pads separate off of their backing plates, and then that person has no brakes. Or, it's not likely that all of them would separate at the same time, but even the loss of brakes on one tire can make the car stop, and pull to one direction or another, maybe in the oncoming traffic lane direction. And this person, I didn't know the person. They were just a customer, but they very well could have their family in the car. They could be trying to rush to take a sick relative to the hospital, not to mention all the other commuters on the road. And it's a situation where I could put the cheap brakes on the car, but it's just that twinge of like, this does not seem like the right way to go. I mean, wherever the origin of that sort of intuition or that feeling or that sort of, neon bulb that comes on in our heads, like, I don't know about this. That's typically when value conflicts occur. That's typically how they occur, is that sort of suspicion keeps growing. Or it's like sometimes we immediately, we latch onto it like, whoa, this is bad. But in this case, so the situation is, I was like, I don't want to put these on this car. So I would go talk to the parts person. And then when I talk to the parts person, the line is, oh, we've got a new brake parts vendor, and we're going to use their stuff from now on because it saves the company money. And yeah, the pads don't look that good, but they'll stop. Don't worry about it. They'll stop the car. And so I took that, and I thought about it and walked back to the car. And I looked at those pads. And so now it's a situation of, well, do I balk against the system? Do I say, no, I'm just not going to do this, and risk being fired or being, the unhelpful employee? But then you got to compare the disvalue of that with the disvalue of like commuter death, on the interstate. And so regardless of which way I ultimately resolve this situation, the core question remains, what would morality or ethics have had me do? What would be the morally better or morally worse course of action for me to have taken? That's that question. When is this action moral or immoral? What would my moral judge have me do? That's not easy in my life experience. That sometimes you do spend some time thinking about this if you have the time and you're in certain situations. Another example would be parental advice. Say that one's child comes to them and says, then it's a teenager, say the child's like 15 years old, and they say, oh yeah, I'm pregnant. Or, oh yeah, my girlfriend's pregnant. And the girlfriend or whoever happens to be like 15 too. And as a parent, there's a moment where, okay, this is when the advice has to come into play. What exactly do I suggest my child do? That does one suggest like maybe abortion? Because it's like, there's a huge disvalue sometimes with teenage pregnancies. We're aware of that. There could be, that it derails, certain life plans, certain educational plans, certain career plans. It locks a person's path down. A lot of options that were there may seem to have narrowed. And parents tend to want to keep as many options open for their child as possible. But then it could be that the parents, it could be perceived differently. It could be like, okay, well, this is great. This is the way it worked for me, whatever. And so context matters with this tremendously. But either way the context goes, it's like a parent could truly struggle with that question. Like, what do I try to suggest that my child do? And some parents could even go to the further end of it. Is like, what do I make them do? Wouldn't it be nice if we had some straightforward way to answer questions like that? What would morality and ethics have a parent do in that situation? And it can be highly contextualized, where we have a lot more data to work with, but that core question is going to remain. So that's kind of a parental advice example of how these questions can show up. Well, then there's cases of preventative war. Our country's done this, historically at times, as well as many other countries. We are certainly not the only country that has done what's known as, we start a war in order to prevent a sort of predicted worst state of events. Like, say that there's a country that we're not on decent diplomatic terms with. We really have zero diplomatic ties to them, so we can't really talk with them. But then it comes to our attention that they're actually, the state and the public officials are sponsoring like a huge terrorist organization. And even say that organization has not really, that specific one hasn't done anything directly to us as a nation yet. But they've done a lot of bad things to a lot of our ally nations. And the idea is we have the ability, like our country has huge military resources. We have, lots of money, lots of military resources, and that gives us a lot of ability to reach out across the international borders. And so the idea is, say one is the president or the president's committee, president of the U.S., and that this question comes around, like the military advisors are like, yeah, we could start a war with this country and in the process maybe eradicate that terrorist organization, or at least cripple all the infrastructure that's supporting it and holding it up. Well, what would morality and ethics have a U.S. president do, or their cabinet members and the Congress and Senate, assuming they have to vote on it, the president doesn't just order it? And what would be the right thing to do? Well, there's huge disvalue to the civilians in that country. Potentially, anytime there's a military incursion, civilian casualties do happen. They don't always have to happen, but they typically do. Somebody, somewhere, somewhen, if there is, bullets and bombs are flying around, it's easy for someone to accidentally step in the path. Or the munition to go in an area that you're not necessarily, wanting it to go. That can happen. There can be ricochets, there can be shrapnel, all the stuff. So the idea is there's a potential huge disvalue. We could actually injure some people that are not sponsoring the terrorist organization. Our military members could. And so there's the disvalue. It could also destabilize a region where other countries there don't, they respond negatively to our intrusion. There could be tons of these sort of disvalued things that just pile up by starting a preventative war, a war to prevent something worse from happening later. But then there could also be huge values to us and maybe the whole region. In that if the terrorist organization was taken down by this preventative war, then that can be a message to any other organizations to not think you're safe anywhere. Or it could be, value in that they could have been planning some attack here, and we stopped all of that at one time. So, you can just keep thinking through the potential upsides of stopping a terrorist organization before it comes to do something to us or some of our allies, versus the disvalue, the civilian casualties, the potential response of other surrounding nations, etc., etc. Wouldn't it be awesome to be able to ask the question, what would morality or ethics have us do as a president or a senator or whatever, and have some definitive answers in return? To actually have some formulaic that we can put these values in and it dump out an answer for us. And then there is trolley problems, which we will this week. You'll see multiple videos about the various trolley problems. These scenarios, trolley, just think train. For our purposes, this is the more English, British way of referring to it. But there are trolleys here too, inside, in, say, San Francisco. But think of the scenario like this. You're standing by a train track, and you notice that ahead on the track there's like 5 workers, or 10 or 100. It doesn't matter. But there's at least more than one person standing in the path of the oncoming train. They're doing loud work. They won't hear the train before it comes and just runs over them. Well, the conductor of the train, whatever, that person, maybe they're checking their cell phone messages or something, but they're not paying attention. They will not see these people in time. And we can see that, say through the window or the side of the train as it comes hurtling past. And so next to us is a lever. And we could choose to pull this lever. If we do, it will divert the train, the runaway train, onto another track. Well, and this is all we have time to do, is to either pull the lever or not. We can't run out there and warn the other people, because they're not going to hear our voice either over their work. But then we noticed that on the alternative track, that if we do pull the lever and the train diverts to this alternative track, there is one worker standing on that track. They're not going to hear, that person is not going to hear the train coming either. So if we do nothing, if we don't pull the lever, which is doing something, that's an action. You're making a decision. You're choosing to not pull the lever, so that's an action. That if we decide to act in the don't pull lever direction, then 5 people will get killed by the train. If we decide to pull the lever, then the train would be diverted to the alternate track, and 1 person would die. Well, what do we do? How do we decide? What would morality or ethics have us do? Is there some way to make a determination about this? That's the way trolley problems tend to go, and you'll see examples of this week. And then the last sort of scenario, and there are many, many others. I'm sure if people just sit and think, you can generate thousands of scenarios like this. Is the notion of driverless cars. We've seen a lot of this, discussion of this on the news of, these sort of autonomous or semi-autonomous vehicles where the software essentially drives the car. It controls the acceleration, the braking, the turning, the navigation. The software in the car is doing all of that. And it's using various sensors all over the car to detect what's in front of it, what's behind it, what's to the sides of it. In many cases, it's like a 360 degree, all the way around, panorama, all the way around view. And then the software has to interpret that data and determine, is this a person that just walked out in front of the car, or is this just a branch in the road? A limb is fallen, it's in the road. Are there, are the cars in front of, the driverless car, are they slowing down extremely quickly? And then the software has to make decisions. It has to make determinations like, should the brakes be applied? Should the car swerve to the left in order to avoid, running into someone that just happens to step out in the street that jaywalks? Or a bicyclist that happens to wobble out of the bicycle lane and over into the car lane? Does the car swerve to avoid hitting that person, but then at the same time, maybe that puts the driver of the car in a more dangerous situation? So the scenario is, what if the car is like that runaway train? And it had, the choice that the software has to decide is, say there are 5 people in the middle of the road and the car's brakes have failed. It detects this brake failure. And it has to decide, do I just keep going forward and run in and injure or kill these 5 people? Or do I swerve and there's like giant trees or culverts or whatever on the side of the road and potentially kill the driver of the car? So should the software prioritize the life of the one driver? Or maybe there's 4 passengers. Maybe it's a driver and like 3 other people. So there's 4 passengers in the car, but there's like 10 people in the middle of the road. Say it's a wreck with a whole bunch of EMS and police or whatever, and then this car's brakes just happen to go out at just the wrong time. Well, does the car decide to sling the driver and the passengers off into a ditch where they may be killed? They're the lower number, 4 people, versus the 15 EMS and wrecker and rollback drivers and law enforcement around a wreck in front of the car, right ahead on the road. Does the car prioritize passenger safety, or does it prioritize people outside the car safety, or animals outside the car? Say that, a whole little herd of piglets comes running across the road, say one's in a rural area, and the driverless car, it's traveling on the road, and here's like 20 piglets that are running across the road, and there's just one driver. Well, does the car prioritize the safety of the driver? And so that means it would choose not to swerve and maybe hit that giant oak tree on the side of the road to save the piglets? Or does it choose to just plow right through the piglets and hope for the best? Which that in itself may endanger the driver. So you see the situation gets more and more and more complicated. That's why, this is a trolley style problem, where typically it's a 2-way decision, swerve or not swerve, or switch tracks or don't switch tracks. And those situations do happen in real life. And maybe not runaway trains with levers, but hopefully this driverless car scenario, this is a sort of real scenario that this is the next follow-up question. How does the programmers of the driverless car software, they have to resolve this kind of situation? Think about that. It's a real concern for the software programmers because they need to program in the car a form of decision-making ability, which we can do that. I've worked with not driverless car software, but AI, synthetic intelligence software. Yes, it does exist, but the reality of contemporary versions of this software is that you're still telling it what to do as the programmer. And so the idea is, well, that means the programmers have to decide an answer to like trolley-style problems. They have to give the car a bias of which to prefer, driver safety or outside car safety. Or, and who's to blame? That's the thing. Who's to blame if the driverless car software decides, oh yeah, the driver's safety is not as important as these 20 piglets. If it just does a straight up just number, like, oh, there's 20 lives versus one life, and it's better for one to die so that 20 can live. If it does a sort of calculation like that, and that's the way it decides, well, what happens when the family of that driver says, whoa, we don't agree? And then they bring up lawsuits against the company. And then moreover, the programmer has some responsibility. They're the programming team that programmed the software. So it's like that morality or immorality, it'll chase back up from that event all the way back to the people who were writing the code. The legality may not. You may be shielded by the company, but the morality or immorality could very well chase all the way back up. And so what would morality or ethics have those programmers do? We'll see. So hopefully these examples, now, I've spent some time talking through them, and like I said, a person can generate hundreds of thousands of more examples like this, and every one of them emphasizes how great it would be, how awesome it would be to have answers to these questions, like when would a specific action or a rule, like you can think of rule like a law of the land, like a lawmakers make, the lawmakers make law. So when would that an action or a rule could also be a computational rule, lines of code. When would it be moral or immoral? When would that specific action or rule be moral or immoral? And then, are there reliable ways to accurately make these determinations? We would certainly hope there are. Well, let's see. So each of these scenarios, hopefully that a person now, is starting to notice, these things could be significant. Answering these style of questions could be significant to some people. And that they also have immediate real world implications. Notice that every single one of these things with these questions, they matter. Like people can be hurt or harmed. That there's a true risk involved of like human health, life, safety, of all ages. That it could be animal life and safety too with cheap brakes or driverless cars. And also with war. And so this isn't just limited to human species stuff, that there's a lot more life than just human life at stake in some of these scenarios. But every one of them, how one answers these, like when is this action moral or immoral, ethical or unethical, and how and whether they think there's a way to accurately decide that. They decide most times the decision will have to be made one way or another, and the way one answers those questions can have a huge impact on how things play out in the real world. And so any guidance we could receive in regards to those questions, like when is this an okay thing to do and when is it not, that would be extremely helpful. So this week we're going to consider the first sort of what would be referred to as a moral or ethical theory. And don't let the notion of a theory dissuade you. That all theory means in this context is it's just a bundle of claims that in this case are trying to suggest answers to these two questions, and there's a lot of reasoning and sort of evidence offered in support of the various suggestions that are made. That a theory in many cases, and what a theorist does, is typically there are some questions, there's some problems, and that person or group of people, in the context of like this theory, consequentialism, people have worked with this way back. I mean, we can find evidence of consequentialist thinking all the way. Romans did this. I mean, it's at least existed in Roman times, and there's really no reason to think that it wasn't way before then, too. And so, and then there's been, but it hadn't become like formalized, like written down in some systematic way until the last, 400 years. And this is widespread. Consequentialism, it's a way of thinking about and answering these style questions, as well as others, but for our purposes, these two questions. So a theory and theorist, they're just suggesting answers to some questions. They're essentially saying, here's our best guess of how to answer those questions, and here's why you may want to buy into our best guess. And so this week we look at this moral theory or ethical theory, consequentialism. Next week we'll look at deontology and deontologist. Don't let the fancy words or any of that bother you. It'll become really clear why this is called consequentialism as we move forward in this video. And we'll explain deontology, next week. We'll talk about it. Consequentialism is a really neat theory. Is that the sort of core imperative, think it like moral imperative. An example of an alternative moral imperative that more people may be familiar with is something like the sort of golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's a command. That's an imperative. It's not just a declarative sentence, a statement of fact. It's actually giving a suggestion or advice or command of how to behave in the world. Well, that's what consequentialism, this is just one way to phrase their sort of imperative. Some people will present consequentialism in terms of this sort of imperative claim. It can be presented in terms of others. We'll talk about those throughout the video. But this is the way I think it'll be the easiest for us to make sense of it. Is that with consequentialism, when we ask, what should I do on any given scenario? Well, always do the best for the most. Always do the best for the most. Just think about that. Take time to think about what that's saying. So always do the best for the most. And then another way to make it a direct answer to this first question, when is a specific action or rule moral or immoral? Well, the consequentialist answer is a specific action or rule is moral when it results in the best overall consequences for the majority of beings affected or effected by it. Otherwise, it's immoral. So that's telling us when is is providing an answer to that first question. So when is it okay or not okay to do something? Well, it's okay to do something when the consequences of doing that thing are the best overall for the majority of beings, people or animals or whatever, affected or effected by that action. We're going to have to look at some drawings, some diagrams to really make sense of what this means. But that's how we get from, when you look at this sort of answer to that first question, it's implying always do the best for the most. That imperative is what's contained in these words. These words, these two things are saying essentially the same thing. A lot of words or just a few words. A statement of fact, a declarative sentence versus an imperative sentence. But the meaning is the same in both cases. There's just a little more specificity with these words than in that. But always do the best for the most, or an action is moral when it results in the best overall consequences for the majority of beings affected by Microsoft, thanks. Always doing the best for the most, or a specific action is moral when it results in the best overall consequences for the majority of beings affected, effected by it. Otherwise, it's immoral. So what does that actually mean before we start looking at diagrams? So when would an action be immoral? Well, when it does not result in the best overall consequences for the majority of beings affected by it. And the notion of affect effect, that actually matters in this context. You effect something when it's like a physical effect. You throw a rock, a window breaks. Cause effect. Affect tends to be more feeling, is more cognitive, mental stuff. So you throw some hurtful words at a person and it hurts their feelings. That's affect. Effect is you throw a rock and it hurts a window. But the window's not really hurt, but it breaks. So you see when you could hurt versus, you just tear up. But we can have these on both things, like you could throw a rock at a person and it could, injure their body. So that is an effect of your action of throwing the rock. You could also throw some mean words and hurt someone's feelings. So this covers both sides of that, where it's like an action could have affective consequences, it could have effective consequences. And in this case, it's moral when it results in the best overall consequences for the majority of beings that are affected by it. Otherwise, it's immoral. Well, let's look at a diagram to gain a sense of this next part of it. Here's a drawing. Oh, come on. Okay. This is the sort of drawing, the way that consequentialism is typically presented. In what we're doing, which is known as a form of like normative ethics in philosophy, that typically the chain of events of what happens when an action occurs is like there's 3 stages. Initially, we just have an agent or an actor. This is a person. You, me, our neighbor, whoever, doesn't matter. That's the agent or the actor. That person has desires, they have motives, they have intentions, they have values, they have disvalues, they also have beliefs, they have commitments. Just think of all the motive sort of mental gear that we could have in our head at any given time. This typically is the reasons why this person acts. It's the thing that motivates their action, all this cognitive stuff. And so we know this, that people, any agent, any actor, will have various desires, motives, intentions. Like, think about it when in criminal scenarios where, law enforcement, they're looking for the motive for the crime. Like, why did this person do this? They want a sort of explanation of what beliefs, desires, what guided their actions, what was prompting them to act in the way they did. Because we know that could be helpful at times, to understand why did this person do what they did. That's what this is pointing to. These desires, motives, values, disvalues, beliefs. I didn't put beliefs here, but it's definitely in this. So this is going on in a person's mind. And then, based on some of this stuff, they decide to act in a certain way. They make a decision. They do something. Like an example would be they decide to start a preventative war or not. Or a person decides to spill the beans to one friend about the other friend that's, behaving unfaithfully toward them. That's the action. You see, these are where all your thinking is happening here. Your thinking and feeling. And then whatever that results in, eventually prompts a person to act, to decide in a certain kind of way. Well, as soon as anything we do, this is the understanding, for this sort of normative ethical framework that we work in all semester, that as soon as we act, there are always consequences. And so it's important to look at these arrows, that anytime we act, typically there will be consequences for us. So say that I really desire a lot of quick cash. I decide that the best way to do that is to go, steal somebody else's stuff. Well, that action, the decision, and that is an action, the actual doing of it is an action. And so that could have immediate consequences for me. You see that arrow whipping back around to the agent. Namely, I could have more money now. I wanted money, now I have it. So one consequence could be I have the money and I'm happy about having the money. That's an affect consequence. That I wanted it really badly. I went and did this theft. Now I have it, so I'm happy. One consequence is the fact if I didn't have money, now I do. That's a physical effect consequence. Then the affect is that having that money makes me happy. So you see that one arrow is more than just one consequence. It's standing in for all those physical and emotional, psychological, everything that happens as a result of that action. That action causes effects to come back to me, the agent, the actor. It also causes affect to come back to me as the agent and the actor. Say that after a while I start to feel guilty about that theft. Well, that is an affect consequence from that action. It may take a while, but say it eventually occurs. So these can be short term, like immediate happiness. I wanted money, now I have it. That can be, but it can also be longer term consequence. Like 2 years later, I really start to doubt that that was a good thing to do. And that starts grinding on me psychologically. So that one arrow can mean many consequences wheeling back around to me as the agent, the actor, or to any agent or actor. As well as notice all these arrows. And then notice all these people. You could also, my unlimited drawing ability is why there's no cats and puppies and stuff in here, because they would be in here too. Like we can act in certain ways that affect other living beings just besides humans, represented by all these stick people. That, but any action we do typically because we live in a highly social world. We have families, we have friends, we have jobs, which means we have coworkers, we have bosses, we have people all around us. I mean, we're also in a whole nation. And we have whole systems built where, just think about it, it's a neat exercise to just take a typical day in your life, like a typical day, and try to count up how many people you cross paths with on any given day. Even if it's just sending text messages or, making comments on YouTube videos or Facebook or whatever. Just think about how many people your actions actually reach out and kind of ping on any given day. And just count them up. Well, that's why most any action we take always sweeps out with effects and affects for lots of people. That there are always consequences, and those consequences can be short term, they can be long term. There are lots of them though. And then there's also this situation where there's always a certain group of folks normally that, yes, sometimes we like to think that, we're really important and that our actions have far-reaching effects. Well, yes, they do. There's no doubt about it. But there's typically always a lot of other folks too, and animals and whatever, that are really not impacted at all by certain of our actions. Like, here's an action. Say I wake up in the morning and I tie my shoes. Okay, does that really reach out to everybody in the world? No, it doesn't. But it could have consequences for some people in that say that I didn't tie my shoes very well. And so then my child's out playing in the yard, and say there's a little neighborhood highway in front of the house, and that the child Say, their ball bounces in the road. They go to run for the ball. I see a car coming that the child doesn't see. And so I spring into action to go run to save the child, or to prevent an injury with the child and the driver in the car. But then my shoelaces, because I did such a poor job tying them during the morning, they come untied at that very moment. I trip, I fall, the kid gets hit by the car, on and on and on. So even that simple little act of tying one's shoes, better or worse, in the morning can, before the day's done, reach out to have consequences for way more than just the person who's wearing the shoes. That's how even the simplest of actions could take on a moral aspect or an ethical component later in the day or years down the road. Something very simple will have consequences. Or something complicated. I mean, think of the action of deciding whether or not to do a preventative war. Ooh, that's a big bundle of folks that could be affected. So now let's think back to the consequentialist. They say that when will this action, how do we determine if this action is a good action, a morally okay, morally not okay, ethically good, ethically bad action? How do we determine that? Well, they say that we should always do the best for the most, that the consequences of that action are what ultimately serve to determine whether it was a good action or bad. That's what makes them consequentialist. So when it comes to assessing the morality of this action, was it morally good or bad, we don't look at the desires, the motives, and intentions, the values, disvalues. We ignore that. We don't look at the actual action. Doesn't matter what it was. According to the consequentialist, all we need to do to determine when is an action good or bad is look at all these effective affective consequences for the majority of beings affected by it. The majority of beings affected by it. What does that mean, though? Well, first off, it means that, like I said, we don't really have to care about this. For a consequentialist, we do not care why someone did what they did. That's part one. Part two is we don't really care what they did. That's not really relevant either. According to consequentialists. Remember, this is their suggestion. That we don't want to get hung up in why people did what they did and what they actually did. All we need to do to figure out is an action okay or not is to look at the consequences that action has on the majority of people or beings affected by that action. I'm saying this a lot just to give everybody a sense. So let's see, how does that actually play out? So let's go to the next diagram. Say we have three people. Here's the agent, marked with a capital A. That's the agent, the actor, the one that does the action. And here's these two other folks. Well, and this is what's sometimes referred to as the whole. Like the whole, the group, that the action, like this is the only three people that the action is going to impact. So that's the whole. Everybody that will be affected by the action. So in this case, this is the whole, including, of course, the agent and the actor. Anybody that's hit by these arrows, that is the whole that is affected by the action. But, the consequences impact. Anybody impacted by a consequence of an action is the whole. That's all the people affected. So here's the whole. And now we could reinterpret consequentialism. When it says always do the best for the most, we can reinterpret that to say always do what's best for the whole. Always look out for the good of the whole. Like we've heard this before. I know people have heard this. That sometimes they say, especially when the action, doesn't seem, like some people are going to suffer because of it. We say, well, what justifies those few people suffering, for this act, as a result of this action? How is this action not bad? See, these people over here, they're suffering because of it. Well, you say, but it was done for the good of the whole, the good of the many. That's the same as doing the best for the most. Those are synonymous. They mean the same thing in terms of consequentialism. So the goal here is, however it turns out when this agent acts, the action will be moral as long as the consequences of that action benefit the majority of people inside that whole. So here's a way to do it with numbers. So say that the agent does something, like this person decides to, I don't know, they steal some money. Well, they steal the money, and here's like their spouse or their partner, and then here's the person that the money was stolen from. So the idea is they stole from this person, and they were successful. So they get like a +9 on the benefit scale. The actual numbers of this, they don't matter right now. Just think of it in terms of this person's happy. They've got money now that they didn't have, that they didn't get caught. I mean, just think of all the things, the good for that person, like the benefit, the upside of their action. And it comes pouring back on them, that like they acted and then the arrow comes back. The effect arrow comes back to them. And so they experienced an overall increase. Say if there was only 10 points total available in terms of benefits and losses, this person receives a +9. 9 out of 10 positive benefits from having stole from someone else. And then say this is the partner. And say that now that this person has all of this money, they take the partner on a vacation. And now their happiness increases, that the going on the vacation is a consequence of having the money, that's a consequence of the theft. So you see how that chain of consequences can get kind of, it keeps stretching out. And so now this person's really happy as a result of this person's theft. So the negative, though, because let's be realistic, any action is always going to have some benefit to us and some detraction. There's always going to be some amount of loss in anything we do. Like, for example, say that a person decides to go off and do like Red Cross disaster relief. That say that, there's some big storm or there's an earthquake and someone decides, oh yeah, I want to go to help people. Well, yeah, there may be a tremendous benefit to that person and many, many others for that. But there's also going to be a loss, like say that person has to miss some days of work, which the employer may or may not, pay one while they go off on disaster relief aid. They may or may not get paid. If they're volunteer to do this, so they may take a financial hit to do this, decent thing for other people, but that may not bother them. So, they still get a huge benefit for choosing to act in that way. They do as well as many, many other people. But there's still typically some kind of loss, like that may be time away from their family. They may have to put on hold watching that latest and greatest television series that they've been waiting for months. But they're like, well, that's really, a minor thing to miss the airing of the first episode of the first season. I'll watch it when I get back. But it's still a loss. So every action, so it could be a little loss, like 1 out of 10. But 9 out of 10 benefit. But every sort of action, the consequences will tend to always be some admixture of benefits and losses. Those losses may not bother you as an individual, and they may not bother other people. Like, say that the idea here is like, say, the spouse or the partner that goes on the vacation with the thief as a result of the thief getting the money, is that this person may have to miss some work, though, to go on that vacation, so they may not get, their money, or they may have been kind of planning to do something else that they did want to do, but not as much as going on the vacation, but they still feel a little hint of, well, I guess I'll have to reschedule, and that's going to take some time. So there's always going to be a certain amount of loss, certain amount of gain as a consequence of any action. At least according to consequentialists. Remember, I'm just channeling their way of thinking. I'm not saying this is accurate or inaccurate. I'm just describing the way consequentialists think about actions and consequences. In our case, so the idea is, well, we have these three people. They're the whole in this case. They're the only ones impacted by the action. They're the only ones who incurred consequences. Well, these two people increased, got an overall huge benefit. This person over here, though, that was stolen from, they have a +1. So how did they benefit? Well, maybe they got to meet some friendly law enforcement people when they reported the crime. They would not have met those people had they not been robbed. So that would be a plus. But then overall, though, like that doesn't really outweigh the tremendous loss of the theft. So the theft is like -9 out of 10. I mean, they took a big hit, which maybe that prevents them from taking their kids to Disney World and their spouse like they've been wanting to do all this time. Not to mention their safety and security's been violated by the theft, and that makes them worry more, have more anxiety for days and days and days. So they have consequences too, and their consequences tend to be pretty much negative. But there is maybe some minor benefit in there. It does not outweigh the negative, but it's still there. So there's your sort of plus minus distribution across the whole. Well, then the consequentialists say an action is moral insofar as it benefits, it does the best for the most, or the good, it did the best for the whole. Well, here's the whole. It's three people. Those two of these, have a net benefit. Only one has this net loss. So that's the majority. When consequentialists talk, like this statement over here. Let's go back. A specific action or rule is moral when it results in the best overall consequences for the majority of beings affected by it. Okay. So there's the majority. Was the majority made overall better off as, given the consequences of the agent's action? Well, in this case, yes. If there was only three people and these two benefited significantly, there's only one that really had a big loss. Well, these two make up the majority, 2/3. There's three. They're two of the three, so they're the majority. And they just, and they're the majority in regards to they're both benefiting. And they didn't just break even. They came out ahead. So the action was best in this case for the most people impacted by the action. The majority was made better overall for that action. Well, that means, according to consequentialism, it's moral. Immediately, the people will be suspicious about that. But that is the way it works. But it could go the other way around. So let's go to this scenario, this next one. Let's do the same thing with the theft. Say that this is the agent once again. This person steals from these two people. So the agent, once again, they didn't have money. Now they do. They're happy about having that money. Maybe they decide to go buy a new fancy car, given this new influx of cash. And the actor, the thief, is very, very happy and reaps all kinds of good consequences. Maybe the thief feels a little bit guilty, or maybe they stump their toe on the way outside of the houses of these people. But really not too much of a loss, but a whole lot of gain from the act of theft. And they're not caught. So that's a big plus. So there's your thief again. But in this case, two people out of the three were made significantly worse off due to that act of theft. So now two of the three are made worse off. They're the majority. They are the people in this scenario that took a hit out numbers the amount of people in the scenario that actually did a net benefit. So according to consequentialism, this is not the best for the most anymore. This is the best for one, but it's 1 out of 3. In fact, that action resulted in negative for 2 out of 3. So the most people involved in this, the majority, was made worse off by that person's action of theft. And any time the most are made worse off, well, the action's immoral, according to consequentialism. See how tidy that is, though? All we have to do is just count it up. How awesome is that? I mean, think about how difficult it was with those first scenarios. So let's go back to one of those. So let's go back to the, let's go over here. Let me see, which was one of these things? The cheating friends. Yeah, this immediately gives us an answer to that. So say that the agent tells this person that this person over here was cheating on them. So the agent remains friends with this person. This person's extremely thankful for being informed about the infidelity of that person. Sure, the agent loses this person as a friend, the one doing the cheating, and then this person loses a partner, but in the overall they value, the truth, the honesty. The one that was being cheated on understands that, that you went well out of your way to be, to inform them, and they appreciate the difficulty of your decision. Sure, they really don't, they feel lost for having lost their partner because, say, they leave them. But maybe this person comes and now you and them become partners. So say that, the two of you benefit tremendously in the short and long term. This was the cheater. That person takes a very significant hit. But that would be a way to show that you did the right thing by telling this person that this other one was cheating on them. Why? Because the results of your action, the consequences, produce the greatest amount of majority well-being, the greatest amount of majority benefit. It could go the other way, though, that you could tell the person and you feel good about it, but you end up say this would probably not be a 9 with a 1 anymore. It may be a 6 and a 4, but you end up losing both of these people as friends. They start hating each other. This is both of your friends. They, divorce, and maybe -9, maybe they end up getting in a super violent altercation. Their wedding plans are called off. Their lives just go down the drain. Terrible for your action. So you benefited in the sense that you feel like the righteousness of having done what, is your group or your, absolute it, whatever would have you do, but yet these two people took a tremendous hit. Well, according to consequentialism, the majority was made worse off by your action of telling one what the other was doing. Well, that makes your action immoral. So that is how to determine that. What are we looking at, though? We're not looking at why you did the things. We're not really looking at what the action is. I mean, sure, it was cheating or it was theft or whatever. Or the action in that case was you telling someone about the cheating. But the idea is that we're just looking at the results, the consequences of whatever you decided to do or a person decides to do. That's it. And the consequentialist claim is that if we can tally up these numbers for any given action that we do, we figure out how many positive consequences impacted the people and how many negative consequences impacted people, the whole involved in, as a result of our action. Then we just look at the numbers. And if our action did best by the most, then it was good. If our action did worse by the most, then it's bad. And if it just breaks even, like if everybody benefits the same, everybody loses the same, so these two essentially cancel, so it's like zero, it's a null, well, then that's neutral. Morality doesn't have anything to say one way or another about your action. You can do it, you cannot do it. It doesn't matter as far as morality is concerned. And so that, that could be a case of like maybe you tie your shoe and there's really, now you have tied shoes, but your feet hurt at the end of the day because you tied them too tight. And so it's just 5 plus and 5. Well, you didn't, this person didn't have to watch you fall on your face because your shoelaces came untied. Well, that's fine. They get a half increase, but then also they don't really like the way your shoes look. So that's a half decrease. Whatever you need to do to make sense of these numbers is fine. But just to say that a scenario where all the numbers, essentially cancel, well, then that's morally neutral. Ethics, morality has nothing to say about that. And whatever judge, that you would pick for your meta-ethical position, they have nothing to say one way or another about it. All right, so let's take the next step. What about when we go to that original picture again, though, and now it's much more people? Like our action, you see, has these numbers. Like this becomes more realistic, where we could have, minus 90 plus 10, say that 100 was the total possible, like, you can think of these as like well-being points or benefit and negative points. Pros, con points, whatever you want to at this point. We're going to have to talk about what that actually means later in the video. But at this point, just to get a sense of how consequentialism works, what its suggestion is it say you have this scenario, and it's like, a certain amount of people, everybody benefits some from your action. You do too. So you remember that arrow whips back around. So the actor, the agent, benefits tremendously in this case and takes very minimal loss. And some other people are like that. This person here actually benefited more by the action than the actor did and lost even less than the actor did. So this action did really well by that person, but then it did really badly by this one. This person got a +2 but a minus 98. So as a result of this agent's action, that person, they lost bad. So, and then this one was pretty much neutral. Didn't really make much, those two values will cancel out. So it could be a dispersion like this, a distribution like this, where it's like, whoa, okay, so now how do we do something with that? What would the consequentialists have us do? This looks like much more complicated. And it is in one way. But then also notice in the no consequence section, these people were not affected or affected by the agent's action. So they have 0 plus or minus. To them, they don't know this happened, and they feel no effects from it, so they're just zeros. But everybody impacted, they'll always get a score, according to the consequentialist. And so how do we deal with this, though, where it's mixed up like that? Well, we can do some graphs, some charting. That's what we can do. So let's determine in this case, like we have all of these numbers, pluses, minuses. Well, one of the easiest ways to look and determine the morality of an action in this case, according to the consequentialist, is we could just make a, bar chart. And now how do we look at graphs like this? Or it's a bar chart, not necessarily a graph. It depends on, how your, a statistics teacher wants to refer to these, but typically this is a bar chart. So looking at these numbers, here's a 99 and a 1. All right, well, that corresponds to this person. And then notice we had a 99 and a -5. Well, that would be the agent. So the blue is the benefit. The orange is the loss. This is the hit that that came as a result of as a consequence of the action, and this is the benefit scores. And so a person can look at this. I'm not going to line up on every one of these things, but if you look at all these numbers, they're represented here. So each of these bars, each vertical bar in this case is a person. This is an individual, and this is their benefit in blue. This is their loss in orange. And so the consequential is, how do we assess? This is what the action, consequence, outcome, the outcome in terms of pros, cons, this is what it looks like. So how do we determine whether this was a good or a bad action? Was it moral or immoral? Well, remember, we just need the best for the most, or the majority of people had to have been made better off than they were before our action, after our action. That the consequences of us having acted in the way we do, and that we did, it has to make the world a better world for more people than it took away from people. The majority had to have been benefited in the overall. Well, we look at this. So how do we make sense of this? Well, here's the neutral person. 50 plus, 50 minus. So 50 benefit, 50 loss. So that's the break point. That's the neutral mark. Didn't really matter one way. I mean, it mattered to the person, but it's still a sort of neutral in terms of the numbers. And so then we look. Well, notice above, anything above this mark, this halfway point, anything to the left of it is going to be people who benefited more than they lost. And so we can count the ones who benefited. So this benefited more than lost. This person did. This one did. This. And so now we just count. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So 11 people benefited by whatever this action was. They have a net overall benefit from that action. They have some loss, but anytime they're above 50%, they benefited by that action. Well, then we look over here on the right-hand side. Anything to the right of that 50-50 break point, these are the people who lost more than they gained as a result of whatever the action was. So now we can count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so 6 people took an overall net loss due to whatever this action was. But 11 people overall got a net benefit. They were impacted positively overall by the action. So, according to consequentialists, what is the majority? Well, everybody to the left of that 50-50 bar. So, everybody from here to the left, that's your majority. There was, the part of the whole. This is the whole. Every person in it is the whole. But then the majority is just all of those, in this case, to the left of the 50-50 split. So it's all these people. So as a result of whatever this action happened to be, 11 people benefited. 6 people lost out. They have more of a net loss. Well, according to consequentialists, all we have to do for an action to be moral or ethical is for it to have benefited the most people. It did the best by the most people. The majority was made better off by that action. And this would be, if you want to use majority minority, this would be the minority. The fewer people out of the whole. So the majority benefited. These people lost. I mean, this one person lost terribly for it. But that doesn't matter, because according to consequentialists, what makes an action ethical or unethical is that the most people, the majority of the whole benefits. You did the best for the most by this action, so it's moral. It could go the other way, though. So say we increase the numbers. See, this is the beauty of consequentialism. It doesn't matter how many people are involved. As long as you can assign numbers to their benefits and the losses, you can do this. And you can see it. That's the beauty of this style half and half bar chart is remember the blue is the benefit, the orange is the loss. So in this case, was this a moral or an immoral action? Well, how many people benefited? So they need to be over like the mid-range, which would be 50, which is right here. So it seems like 1, 2, well, we can just look at the bottom, 7. So 7 people benefited by whatever this action was. And so how many people lost? Well, anybody that goes below 50 in this case, and there is no 50-50, it was not a neutral action to anyone. Either it greatly benefited these 7 people or, well, 8 to 28, so 20 people took a hit, a bad hit from it. So this could be an example of your driverless car. That say it's a SUV that's being driven by this autonomous software, and it had passengers. There were 7 people in the SUV or a van, and they survived. But the car's decision was to protect the passengers at all costs, and in order to do so, it ended up swerving in front of a school bus to avoid, say there was a limb in the road. And say there's a limb in the road and the car perceives that as an immediate danger. And it makes the decision to avoid the limb because that's certain that has a huge risk of killing all the occupants of the car. But in order to do that, it has to kind of swerve in front of that bus so it can, like, say the school bus is coming this way. The car is going here. It sees a limb. So it's like, woo, and it swerves over to the left. Well, the school bus driver loses control and then rolls the bus. And here's the driver and, say this would be death down here. Like this is dead children. I mean, I know that sounds extreme, but hey, reality is extreme sometimes. And so this is, the kids that were killed, and then this could be some of their family involved. And, so now the idea is how would consequentialists assess the results of that action? Well, it made the most worse off. So it was immoral. Action's immoral. The best is not achieved for the most in this case. And so what about neutral, indifferent? What does that look like? Well, here's one way it could look. It doesn't have to be a 60-40 split. It could be like 20-80 and then 80-20. It doesn't. I just picked these numbers just to make, to have a demonstration of it. But this would be neutral. There's 10 people that came out with a 40 loss, 60 benefit. Then there's 10 more over here that come out with a 60 loss and a 40 benefit. So this pretty much, all of this cancels out. There is no majority in this case. It's an even split. So in terms of morality, we can't make an assessment about that. The only thing consequentialist says we can do in those cases is whatever is picked, it really doesn't matter. I mean, morality itself or ethics doesn't have anything to say about it. I mean, you can still, the numbers may be worthwhile to notice, but we can't make a moral or an ethical determination on this action. It's just beyond our ability to make a determination. Because the most, well, first off, the most doesn't exist because it's an even split. And there is no best for the most. Because these people, yes, these half of the people did benefit, but then the loss of these cancels out their benefit. And so really you could just turn this into 50-50 all the way across. There's nothing, consequentialism has nothing to say about actions, that the consequences of actions that turn out like this, there's nothing it can say for us. So that's a way to think about what all these numbers mean and how it plays out for consequentialists. So let's go back to our sheet.